The visual is not important here. The music is not important here. The voice is not important here. What matters are the words. If you cannot listen to the words, you do not belong here. If you understand this, welcome to the Fate Club. Thinking continues, but the owner of thought quietly disappears. Thoughts still arrive with their familiar rhythm, their familiar vocabulary, their familiar urgency, yet something subtle breaks between the thought and the sense of self that once rushed to inhabit it. The mind speaks, but no one steps forward to sign the message. This is not silence. This is not peace. This is not control. This is thought occurring without residence, movement without identity, content without a claimant. A sentence forms internally and dissolves before it can harden into belief. An opinion appears fully shaped and then collapses when no one reaches for it. Memory surfaces, but it no longer carries the authority of proof. Thinking without identification does not feel elevated. It feels strangely neutral, almost mechanical, as if cognition has been unplugged from a need to protect an image. The nervous system continues its operations, language continues to generate meaning, but the reflex to defend, justify, or personalize quietly fails to activate. The most unsettling part is not the absence of emotion, it is the absence of ownership. Anger can arise without a person being angry. Fear can flicker without anyone becoming afraid. Desire can pass through without demanding obedience. Thought used to function as a badge, a weapon, a shelter. Now it behaves more like weather, observable, transient, indifferent to interpretation. The mind continues to narrate, but the narration no longer defines character. This is where discomfort appears, not as pain, but as disorientation. Without identification, thought loses its ability to anchor identity. The old question of who is thinking quietly fails to produce an answer. The system searches for the familiar contraction, the habitual tightening around ideas that once provided structure. It does not find it. What remains is cognition operating without a center. There is a subtle shock in realizing that thinking never required belief to function. Logic still connects. Language still organizes. Planning still happens. Yet none of it needs to be believed to occur. The belief was never the engine. The belief was the attachment. This is where the collapse begins, not dramatically, not catastrophically, but functionally. Thoughts stop demanding loyalty. They stop asking to be defended. They stop insisting on continuity. A political opinion arises and dissolves without friction. A personal story surfaces and loses relevance mid-sentence. An internal argument starts and ends without resolution because resolution no longer serves a role. The mind continues to produce content, but identity no longer feeds on it. The internal commentator keeps speaking, yet the audience quietly leaves the room. This shift does not feel like awakening. It feels like a system discovering that a background process has been running without purpose. Thinking remains, but identification times out. The shock comes when reaction becomes optional. A thought triggers no movement. An impulse triggers no narrative. A memory triggers no defense. This is not discipline. This is not suppression. This is the nervous system failing to locate the mechanism that once converted thought into self. Without identification, thought loses emotional gravity. It can still describe danger, but it no longer creates fear by default. It can still recall injustice, but it no longer fuels outrage automatically. The mind becomes accurate but irrelevant, precise but unconvincing, functional but no longer authoritative. This is where the old structures panic. Identity systems rely on identification to maintain continuity. Without it, the sense of self begins to fragment, not into chaos, but into neutrality. There is no replacement identity waiting. There is no higher version stepping in. There is only the gradual realization that identity was never required for perception to occur. Seeing continues. Hearing continues. Thinking continues. But the need to be someone who sees, hears, and thinks quietly evaporates. This is experienced first as loss. A loss of urgency. A loss of certainty. A loss of internal pressure. The internal voice keeps offering conclusions, but nothing accepts them. Advice arises internally and falls flat. Judgments form and dissolve without consequence. The system begins to operate without commentary. Actions happen without a story being attached. Decisions occur without a narrator claiming authorship. This is deeply unsettling to the part of the mind trained to equate identity with survival. Without identification, the old motivational structures lose leverage. Fear-based urgency stops working. The body still responds to stimuli, but the reactions are clean. No residue remains. No mental echo loops back to reinforce meaning. Thinking without identification reveals something uncomfortable. Most suffering did not come from thought itself, but from the reflex to become it. Without that reflex, thought is exposed as neutral data, linguistic noise, pattern generation, without inherent command. The authority of thought collapses quietly, without resistance, without ceremony. This is not enlightenment. This is not transcendence. This is a system returning to a more efficient mode of operation. The mind no longer needs to be believed to function. It no longer needs to convince to operate. It no longer needs identity to justify its existence. Time perception shifts here. Thoughts no longer stretch into the future with the same insistence. The past loses its persuasive power. Planning happens without anxiety. Memory arises without nostalgia. Anticipation occurs without hope. This neutrality is often mistaken for emptiness. It is not empty. It is unoccupied. The internal space, once filled with identity narratives, becomes spacious, not because something new enters, but because something unnecessary exits. The system does not celebrate this. There is no internal applause. There is only quiet efficiency. Thinking becomes a tool again, not a master. A function, not a definition. A process, not a personality. This is where many attempt to reattach. They search for meaning, purpose, or a new identity to inhabit. The system does not comply. Without identification, meaning becomes optional. Purpose becomes situational. Narrative becomes decorative. The shock is not that thinking continues. The shock is that life continues perfectly well without believing any of it. This state does not remove intelligence. It removes compulsion. It does not remove depth. It removes attachment. Thoughts still arrive. They simply no longer stick. The mind becomes transparent to itself. Its movements visible. Its patterns exposed. Nothing needs to be fixed. Nothing needs to be explained. Nothing needs to be concluded. Thinking without identification is not an achievement. It is the default state re-emerging once the conditioning exhausts itself. The system realizes it was never required to carry the weight it accepted. Thoughts were never meant to be identities. Stories were never meant to be homes. What remains is cognition moving freely, perception unclaimed, awareness uncontracted. No authority is lost. No truth is gained. Only unnecessary ownership dissolves. If you understand this, welcome to the club.